I'm gonna cut right to the chase. There are videos on my YouTube channel that I wish I had never made. Or at the very least, wish I had reworded or just worded differently, maybe made less clickbaity, less controversial. Sometimes as a YouTuber, you have this constant tug of war between wanting to be clickbaity enough that folks want to click on your videos, but not being too clickbaity to where you like piss off your audience and they don't want to click on any video ever again because they know it's just complete crappy clickbait that is misleading and all of that. So I teetered with a lot of that when I was younger, and I was willing to take more risks when I was younger because in college I wasn't sure if YouTube would become a full-time thing or not. There is one video in particular, this one here, that I was intentionally very aggressive with. You could just tell, and we're gonna watch this back together. I was just so snobby. The tone that emanates from this video is just not cool, and this is just part of growing, part of learning. I've learned to not be this way because there's so much that I still don't know about certain topics. Now, this topic in particular, I think is fairly common knowledge for most of us seasoned PC gamers, but I want to revisit it because there are still folks commenting on this video today. This one should be fun, should be a bit cringy on my part, maybe just all around fun for you guys, maybe informative. I hope you will stay with me.
If you're planning your next PC build, then consider checking out our sponsor, VIP SCD Key. Their Windows 10 and 11 OEM keys sell for a fraction of retail and will unlock the full potential of your OS. They'll also remove those pesky activation watermarks. Click the links below to get started today, and be sure to use our special offer code SKGS for a sweet discount on a variety of options, including Windows 10 and 11, Pro and Home, and more.
Let's jump right into it then. Brace for cringe.
There's a lot of misinformation out there, and I realized after my last upload covering Core i7 gameplay that quite a number of you were convinced that lower resolutions result in higher CPU usage, so I'll cut right to the chase. 100% false. There is not the tiniest shred of evidence to suggest that CPU usage increases as resolution decreases. That makes no logical sense, period.
Yeah, okay. Tone right out of the gate is just awful. If I was this way today, I don't think I would have much of a following anymore.
So this claim has its roots in something that is actually true, but only to an extent. The truth being that since lower resolutions yield higher frame rates, the CPU is taxed more proportionally, since it must prepare several more frames, more specifically the physics and calculations to be made within each frame, a case which demands a more parallel computing process for which CPUs are not designed. In this scenario, a lower resolution relieves GPU stress and relieves CPU stress, only slightly in most cases, and consequently adds a bit of pressure to both, since the GPU must now stitch together and render more frames per second, and the CPU must increase its parallel calculation rate.
Okay, graphics cards are much better at parallelization, which basically means that a lot of data can be fed simultaneously through multiple pipelines, because by nature of how GPUs are designed, they have more cores, so they can handle these calculations more efficiently. CPUs, on the other hand, are designed less so for these situations. I'm not totally sure. I'd have to go back and watch this in slow motion. I'm not sure what exactly I was saying in that previous clip, but it could have been worded way better than that. I think this is part of me just being young and dumb and thinking that if I sound more intelligent, people will believe me without actually being concise in what I'm trying to say. And that's just, yeah, it's just a silly way to look at it.
So this is where the roads diverge. We have the truth down one end, that higher frame rates bottleneck CPUs more than GPUs on average, and the disgusting crap uninformed morons are spewing out down the other, that lower resolutions put more stress on the CPU. Because that makes perfect sense.
The condescending tone here. I'm so condescending and for absolutely no reason. It's just, I don't know if maybe I read a comment on Reddit or something and it just really pissed me off, but it should not have bled into a video like that. Really ashamed of how I worded this one. This is worse than I thought. I had only watched maybe like the first minute of this video prior to filming, so much of what I'm seeing here, I'm seeing for the first time in several years, and it's just not great. They don't have to be mutually inclusive. You can have instances where a CPU can be taxed harder at little to no expense on the graphics card side. So you could have the same graphics card utilization in two different instances of the game running, but in one instance, the CPU is also working harder. And it could be the case where maybe VSync is turned on versus off, and that's what we're gonna talk about later in the video. The other statement, the second one that I said was completely wrong, I called it disgusting crap or whatever I did, lower resolutions bottleneck CPUs. Okay, if you just look at this statement as it is, yes, I understand how this could be interpreted as correct or incorrect. So me just trashing whoever believes this on camera, that's what really bothers me about it. I don't know why I was, again, so aggressive and just so off-putting there. There are obviously instances where lowering a game's resolution results in an increased CPU bottleneck. This would be where VSync, let's say, is disabled and the CPU is allowed to process more frames being rendered and drawn by the graphics card. That makes perfect sense. But again, I wasn't specific in this clip here. And so this is just me creating more controversy out of thin air, which many comments in that video were quick to call out. And again, I, in hindsight, 100% appreciate them. You see through the BS, you see through the artificial controversy here, and good on you, because I definitely shouldn't have done this.
Do you see one that says CPU usage increases as resolution decreases? No, you do not, because it isn't true, period, end of story. Thank you, science. This is Science Studio. Share this one with your friends.
Oh
Thanks
boy,
for learning
yeah, please don't share this original video with your friends. All right, we're done here. I'm done with this video, done with the cringe. We'll actually look at some real relevant data today. I think it'll make much more sense. So here we have 3 instances of GTA 5's built-in benchmark running at the same time. I wanted to use this older title because it was one of the ones that we featured in that original video. And you can see here, I've got every instance locked to 60 FPS, 60 hertz. Say you're running on a 60 hertz monitor. It wouldn't make much sense, at least in this title, to run it at any higher because you won't actually see those frames. And in all 3 instances, at least before we get to the street view, you can see that CPU usage is just under 10%. And this is what we should expect because the same number of frames have to be processed in every instance. It wouldn't make a ton of sense to see a huge increase in CPU usage for an increase in resolution because the CPU isn't really a part of the resolution rendering process. Again, that's all being done by the GPU. And you can see that our graphics card usage has actually increased in 1440p. Now we're using a much beefier setup here. This is in my RTX 4080 from Gigabyte, and so it's not going to be working hard regardless because this title is so old and the resolution just isn't very taxing. But on average, you'll notice that GPU usage for the 1440p instance is going to be a tad higher than 1080p, and especially for 720p. There is a small discrepancy in the amount of video memory being allocated per instance, and if you ask me, it doesn't really make much sense for 720p to be much higher than, say, 1080p, but I'm not going to comment any further on that because I just don't know enough about it to explain it. All I can say is this title is not the most optimized, and again, it is much older. So hopefully this example clears up what actually happens behind the scenes when you enable something like VSync. Think of it like a glass ceiling. You're keeping one aspect of your PC from being able to stretch its legs anymore. There will be, again, tiny changes in CPU usage, but by and large, as resolution changes with a constant frame rate, the only component really being stressed any differently is the graphics card. Because again, you're changing the number of pixels being rendered, but you're not changing how many of those frames that those pixels culminate are being processed. Hopefully the second example clears things up a bit more. We're looking at 2 instances of Dirt 5 here, one in 4K, one in 1080p, but this time with VSync disabled, which means we have an unlocked frame rate. Our PC is allowed to fully stretch its legs in both instances and generate as many frames as it possibly can. You'll see GPU utilization is pegged near 100% for both runs, and this is reflecting the fairly aggressive in-game preset. GPU temperatures are about the same. We are using a bit more of video memory for the 4K run. This makes sense considering we are quadrupling the number of pixels being rendered. However, if we look at our frame rate, you'll see that our FPS actually gets cut virtually in half, jumping up from 1080p to 4K. And coincidentally, same goes for our CPU utilization, essentially being cut in half again, jumping up from 1080p to 4K. An interesting note, system RAM usage is about the same for both runs, so it's not really sensitive to in-game resolution, and our CPU frequency is pretty much the same, although you'll notice that it occasionally spikes a bit higher in the 4K run, and this I think is because the CPU is not being stressed as heavily, so it's allowed to boost a bit higher since it's not running as hot. But now, contrast this with the same game, the same settings, the same resolutions, but with VSync enabled. We are of course pegged now at 60 FPS for both runs. That will not change, and our CPU utilizations have dropped dramatically, down to around, again, 12, 13-ish% for both, although although on average, you'll see that the 4K CPU utilization is just a tad higher. The only noteworthy usage change is the graphics cards, whereas in 1080p, we're averaging somewhere around 30 to 40%. In 4K, it's somewhere around 50 to 55. We're still allocating more VRAM to the 4K run. Our CPU frequencies are identical. System RAM usage is identical. You can see that the only noteworthy change is on the graphics card. Of course, our temperatures are going to increase as the graphics card's usage increases, but everything else is pretty much the same. Exactly the same as GTA 5 with VSync enabled, and exactly the same as any other title with the same setting turned on. There may be a game or two out there that breaks the mold. A game like Counter-Strike 2, for example, it doesn't really care much about the graphics card in the system as long as it's not like a GT 1030, and even then you could probably get away with it assuming your CPU is strong enough. It's going to be a little more sensitive there to other changes, but the general rule of thumb is what you just saw. What it ultimately comes down to is whether or not VSync is enabled or disabled, and a side discussion here, but something that should also be strongly considered, the resolution and refresh rate of your current gaming monitor. If you're expected to game at a higher refresh rate, let's say 120 Hz or 144 Hz, then your CPU is likely to be a bigger bottleneck than it otherwise would be at 60 Hz. But to throw one more wrench into the mix, let's consider again Dirt 5 in the 4K resolution, this time with both the VSync and non-VSync options running side by side. Of course, the frame rate's locked on the right and it's unlocked on the left, and of course, the CPU usage is much lower on the right because that frame rate is locked. But the other thing to notice is that the graphics card's utilization is also significantly lower in the 60 Hz run. So another product of locking the frame rate is a reduction in the utilization of the graphics card. And this makes sense if you think about it. The graphics card isn't having to work as hard to render, stitch together as many frames, right? And so it can kind of just chill at a lower temperature, just a lower power threshold overall. It's actually nice if you only have a 60 Hz monitor to have that wiggle room. You could create a much quieter system, but of course you're leaving performance on the table. I don't think anyone at the time was arguing that a reduction in frame rate didn't lower graphics card utilization, but it's just another thing I wanted to point out in case you were curious. I imagine most folks game with VSync on because it wouldn't make much sense to tax your system any more than the frame rate that you're actually going to see at the end of the day. But there are some folks, especially competitive gamers, who prefer having VSync off, and in those cases, the argument would shift a bit. Thank you so much for bearing with me in this one, and for bearing with me over the years. A video like that is, I mean, just watching myself in playback there, it's a really tough watch. And so those that stuck around after videos like that, it is hugely appreciated. Heck, even if you're not subscribed and you just occasionally click on videos like these, it is such a huge help. So thank you so much. If you want to leave feedback in the comment section below, please do that. Consider sharing this video, subscribing, liking it, all of that. We have relevant links as well in the video description. And consider sticking around for the next one. My name's Greg. Thanks for bearing with me.